So I'm going to try this one more time. My stream cut out on me. It just disconnected me from the internet. So we'll try this again. I'm just going to give this a minute or two to stabilize before I start talking again. So I will say hello and welcome to you guys. It's my third attempt at the video going through these chapters. Hopefully it will work. Yeah, I'm just going to give this like a minute to make sure that I don't lose my connection again before I start talking. If that does happen, I will just pre-record something and then upload it later. But hopefully we can do the live stream. I restarted my laptop, so hopefully that will help. Okay, I think I'm good. So yes, third time trying to do this video. The first time I did it, I did not have as good of an understanding of some of the components that are being addressed as I wanted to have, so I deleted that video. And thankfully, one of my subscribers, Monkey, was here during that video to ask a question that I actually wound up doing in a separate video. I would strongly encourage you guys who are unfamiliar with the kind of history of where Isaiah is at time period wise and like the history of the events to just go through the video that I did. It's just a real brief 15-minute video kind of addressing the setup and the division of the northern and southern kingdoms, the house of Israel versus the house of Judah. Isaiah is a prophet to the house of Judah. And so this is going to, and I kind of went through that. The main question, and I'll just kind of highlight what I talked about in that video, was Monkey asked from Jeremiah 3, why does it look like God gave the house of Israel a bill of divorce and not the house of Judah? Simply put, the Redeemer comes through the house of Judah. And that's the concept that we get into in the New Testament, where it tells us that a house divided against itself cannot stand. So God did not sever that part of the relationship with Judah because he would send himself, Jesus Christ, through the Redeemer through the house of Judah. Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, the Davidic covenant, descendant from the throne of David, sitting atop the throne of David, specifically in the millennial kingdom, all of those kind of promises. So Judah was not special in the regard of the wickedness. They weren't less wicked than the house of Israel, but there was a special, what would be covenant in place with the Davidic line, or there actually already was something special in place with the Davidic line through the Davidic covenant, through the house of Judah. That is why, and only for that reason, that God did not also send a bill of divorce to the house of Judah. It's a remnant according to the election of grace, that conversation. So we find ourselves in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet to the house of Judah. And what we saw the setup for in Isaiah 6 was he was given the commission to go to Ahaz, who was the king of Judah at that time, and give him a specific message. The historical aspect, and I went through this in the previous video, it was the house of Israel was about to be taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And that was where the house of Israel kingdom came to an end. There would be no kings after that point from the house of Israel. And I had put a timeline together of that, just kind of my own, like on a whim type thing, started a line of research. Didn't know that would come in handy, but that's why I did the screenshot video, the screenshot type video yesterday, was going through all of that. And you can see clearly on there where the kings from the house of Israel come to an end around this time period, because they're going to be led away at circa 722 BC, 722, 720, somewhere in there. That's where the Assyrians came and carted the house of Israel into captivity. So that historical aspect, the house of Judah was still intact, but because that kingdom was significantly smaller and the house of Israel had provided some kind of protection, well, that would no longer be the case when they were carted into captivity by the Assyrians. So the king of the house of Judah was concerned about this, thinking that there would be destruction that would befall them to the point of annihilation. Because, how is the house of Judah going to defend itself when the house of Israel is gone as their protector, as their big sister? And the commission that Isaiah was given in chapter 6, where we left off, was to give this prophecy to Ahaz to let him know that Judah would not be destroyed. That, yes, judgment's going to befall it because Judah is just as wicked as Israel. And when I say these names, I'm talking about house of Judah and house of Israel. Again, it's the division of the kingdoms that occurred just after Solomon with his sons Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So Isaiah is given the commission to go and prophesy to Ahaz that Judah is not going to meet a total destruction. So that was kind of setting it up for chapter 7. And why? Why would Judah not meet total destruction? Well, that's where we're going to get into this prophecy that first comes and gives the answer in Isaiah 7. But let's set up the scenario in Isaiah 6. And he said in verse 9, Isaiah 6:9, "Go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and convert and be healed." That's talking about a cessation of the wickedness and judgment and the unfaithfulness, the whoredom, the idolatry that that also exists in Judah, but that led to the bill of divorce in Jeremiah 3 between God and the house of Israel. The same problems existed in Judah. Again, the difference with Judah is that the Redeemer would come from the house of Judah. "Then said I, Lord, how long? And he answered, until the cities be wasted without inhabitant, the houses utterly desolate, the houses without man, the land be utterly desolate. The Lord had removed men far away, and there be a great forsaking in the midst of the land. But yet in it shall be a tenth." And then again, there's always a remnant preserved according to the election of grace. The land and the people will never completely be destroyed. "Yet in it shall be a tenth. It shall return and shall be eaten as a teal tree and an oak whose substance is in them when they cast their leaves. So the holy seed shall be the substance thereof." What's the holy seed? Well, Jesus. Galatians. This goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, that the promised seed would come through the line of Abraham, made more clear in Galatians 3, I believe 14 was the verse. "That the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith." No. Verse 16, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, into thy seed, which is Christ." So Isaiah is about to prophesy that, yes, there will come a period of judgment and darkness as a result of it, because light is found in God and through Christ, right? Well, if people are separated by God on account of their wickedness and their idolatry, then they will be in darkness. But there will come a light. God is light, and Jesus is the prophesied light of the world. So light will come upon Israel via the holy seed, and that is prophesied in Isaiah 6:13. "So the holy seed shall be the substance thereof." So we get into chapter 7, and this is where Isaiah is actually giving the prophecy, giving the words of security to Ahaz. Ahaz was a wicked king, and he did not that was right in the sight of the Lord. So for all intents and purpose, he led Israel astray. He was responsible for leading the people into wickedness, into sin, into idolatry. And for all intents and purpose, he should have been destroyed. But he's not going to be. And that is what Isaiah is bringing to him to tell him right here in chapter 7. "It came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah." Again, Isaiah is a prophet to the house of Judah specifically. "That Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up toward Jerusalem to war against it, and could not prevail against it. So the northern kingdom, the house of Israel, Samaria is the capital. The Assyrians are who are going to take it captive." That is what that is a reference to. "It was told to the house of David," house of Judah, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim, and his heart was moved, and the heart of his people as the trees of the wood who are moved with the wind. As the trees of the wood are moved with the wind. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and someone. There's going to be a lot of names I can't pronounce, so I'll apologize now, but I'm not even going to try because I will butcher them, and it will take me longer to try to sound them out and do it incorrectly than it will to just bypass them. So I will apologize. So he says, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field, and say unto him, Take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the two tails of these smoking firebrands, with the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria and the son of Remaliah, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken counsel against thee, saying, Let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabael. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. So even though the house of Israel is going to meet some hardships in the very near future, Judah will not meet the same fate. And this is the word that the Lord is giving as a promise to Ahaz, king of Judah, and not just for that present time, but that the house of Judah will not meet the same final end. It will not be ruined utterly. Why? For the head of Syria is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it shall not be a people. House of Israel. And again, when you look at the historical aspect of that, the kings from the house of Israel ceased shortly after this time period. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. Moreover, the Lord spake again to Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. So Isaiah is saying, ask the Lord for a sign. Ask him to prove his intent toward you to not destroy the house of Judah. And Ahaz says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to tempt the Lord into, giving me a sign just to make me feel better. He said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but ye will weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. It's like, fine, you won't ask. The Lord is going to give you one. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So this is why not only did God not divorce or not give a bill of divorce to the house of Judah, but why he's going to uphold to some extent and into perpetuity the house of Judah. Because the Redeemer, Jesus, shall call his name Emmanuel. That's Jesus, meaning God with us. Matthew 1:23 is the linked verse. And he's going to come directly from the tribe of Judah. They call him the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. That's where that comes from. So the Lord's going to give Ahaz specifically a sign and to the house of Judah that Judah will not be completely destroyed. Why? Well, because it has to be intact enough for the Redeemer to come through that house. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. That's the Messiah. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. Okay, so the house of Judah and the house of Israel are both going to go into captivity, and the kingdoms shall cease from both for a while. The Assyrian captivity was the end of the house of Israel, and the house of Judah came to an end of the Babylonian captivity circa 586 BC, when Solomon's temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was sacked. The Lord shall bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come from the day of Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So that's talking about the house of Israel and the Assyrian captivity. Again, circa 722 BC. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They shall come and shall rest, all of them, in the desolate valleys and the holes of the rocks, and upon the thorns, and upon all bushes. In the same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely them beyond the river, beyond the king of Assyria, the head, the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard. It shall also come to pass in that day that a man shall nourish the young cow and 2 sheep. It shall come to pass for the abundance of milk that they shall give, he shall eat. Oh, and it shall come to pass for the abundance of milk that they shall give, he shall eat butter. For butter and honey shall everyone eat that is left in the land. It shall come to pass in that day that every place shall be where there were 1,000 vines at 1,000 silverlings. It shall be for briars and thorns. So basically what these verses are saying is that when judgment comes, it will affect not only the people, but also the land, and what was for excess and what was for, the good of the land or whatever. It's basically going to become a desolate, barren wasteland. With the arrows and the bows shall men come hither, because all the land shall become briars and thorns. And on all hills that shall be digged with the mattock, there shall not come thither the fear of the briars and thorns. It shall be for the sending forth of oxen and for the treading of lesser cattle. So that's what it's talking about, is a desolation and kind of a wasteland that the land will become on account of these captivities that will come. And both of them will come before the Redeemer comes through the line of Judah. But that the Redeemer will come through the line of Judah is evidence that Judah will not be destroyed. Long story short, Isaiah 8:1, moreover the land said unto me, take thee a great roll and write in it with a man's pen concerning who will become Isaiah's son. The literal translation is speed the spoil, hasten the booty. It's kind of funny, but it's a 6-syllable name. And again, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, but it's in Isaiah 8:1 if you would like to try for yourself. So continuing along, so then I took unto me faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest, Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, and I went unto the prophetess, that was Isaiah's wife. She conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, call his name, this 6-syllable name, for before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria. So that basically gives us the time period to be able to understand completely where Isaiah was at with regard to the impending doom of the house of Israel and when the Assyrian captivity was going to take place. Like, you're going to have a kid, and before your kid even knows to cry, that's when it's going to happen. So it's very close upon them. The Lord spake also unto me, saying, for as much as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloh that go softly and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the water of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria. Again, the Assyrian captivity, and all his glory. He shall come up over the channel, shall go up over all his banks. He shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck. And the stretching out of the wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Associate yourselves, O ye people, and ye shall be broken in pieces. And give ear, all of ye far countries. Gird yourself, ye shall be broken to pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken to pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. So this kind of goes to what Isaiah was saying earlier, that there's going to be this plot, Assyria, Ephraim, to take counsel against Judah. Let us go up against Judah, vex it. Let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of this person. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. So in chapter 8, you're kind of seeing the attempt that, again, is not going to come to pass. It's going to come against Judah, and they're going to make great attempt, but for Emmanuel. And that's what Isaiah 8:8 says. He shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over. He shall even reach to the neck. The stretching out of the wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Take counsel together, it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. And again, that's what Emmanuel actually means. God is with us. So at this point, it's the God of Israel with them, the God of the house of Judah with them, and in the future, the prophecy that points to the Redeemer, Jesus the Son, coming through the line of Judah. Call his name Emmanuel, for it means God with us. He was with them then, and he will be physically with them in the future. For the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand, and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, say ye not confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say, a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear nor be afraid. So he further says, sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. Not these other people that are attempting to come against you and destroy you for ill purposes, but the Lord your God. Give ear to him, give your faith to him, and he will bring you through it. He shall be for a sanctuary, for a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and a snare for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So eventually, he's going to provide salvation to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. We know that comes in the very distant future from where this was, and that actually comes in Isaiah 31. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to their covenant that I made with their fathers when I brought them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break. But this shall be the new covenant. I mean, talking about writing it on their hearts and their inward parts. He shall be to them a God, they shall be to him a people. They shall teach no more every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me. Why? Because he's going to be with them in the millennial kingdom. So, but for people who don't believe on him, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And that is repeated multiple times in the New Testament, because there are many opportunities where Israel had to believe and chose not to. That goes in the Old Testament. Here we see, and then when Jesus actually comes the first time, they had an opportunity to believe him when he was right there front and center with them. Did they choose to? No. And to them also was a snare of stumbling and a rock of offense, becoming the chief cornerstone, building a spiritual house, and them being appointed to blindness, and salvation coming to the Gentiles through the fall of Israel and all of that. So this set of verses is repeated numerous times because there are multiple opportunities that these people have had to believe and they've chosen not to, and their belief has been a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait upon the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. And when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God, for the living to the dead? So he says they're going to wind up asking you to trust these people who are not in the Lord. Why would you do that? Why would you not just trust in the Lord? To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. And again, this goes to the judgment that comes as a result of being in darkness versus salvation that comes as a result of being in the light. He's prophesying in chapter 7 that destruction will not come to Judah, specifically in that point in time when Assyria comes to take captive the house of Israel and they try to form a confederacy against the house of Judah. It will not stand. Why? Because the Lord is going to make it not stand. And the provision that he's making for the future is that the Redeemer will come through the house of Judah, so that Judah will always have a remnant preserved according to the election of grace. For those who don't believe, they will be taken and snared, led away. You know, these things will come upon them because they reside in darkness and they do not move into the light of life, which is in God and through Christ. And again, Christ is being prophesied about in these chapters. So he says, don't give ear to, and certainly don't put your trust in these people who are not in God, because they can't save you, and all they're going to do is continue to lead you astray. So he says, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. They shall pass through it, hardly be stead and hungry. It shall come to pass that when they shall be hungry, they shall fret themselves and curse their king and their God and look upward. And they shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness on account of not being in the light. Dimness of anguish shall they be driven to darkness. Until what point? Until what point will they reside in this darkness on account of being in a wicked state, an idolatrous, non-faithful state? not believing in their God, and certainly not believing in the coming Redeemer. Because again, this goes back to the Abrahamic covenant promises. The promised land promise, the natural seed promise, and the spiritual seed promise, which is Christ, that the Redeemer would come through the line of Abraham. So these people not believing in God at this point, and certainly not looking forward to the promise of the Redeemer that would come through Abraham's line, specifically through the house of Judah. How long are these people going to remain in darkness? Isaiah 9 is the prophecy that is repeated in Matthew 4 at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Isaiah 9:1. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea beyond Jordan in Galilee of the nations. So there would be judgment that would come. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them the light hath shined. Matthew 4. This is after the baptism of Jesus, which began his ministry in Matthew 3. He was led immediately of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil after those 40 days of fasting. Then the 3 temptations of the devil, then angels came and ministered unto him. Next, we find ourselves in Matthew 4:12. Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, where Isaiah 9:1 catches us up to, talking about the affliction and the judgment that will come upon Zebulun and Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea beyond Jordan in Galilee of the nations. And that is where Jesus begins his ministry, in Galilee, after he left Nazareth, in Matthew 4:13. That it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and the shadow of death, light is sprung up. From that time, Jesus began to preach and say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So this prophecy finds fulfillment when these people are brought out of darkness into great light, in the presence of the incarnated God-man, Jesus Christ, their Redeemer, who was sent to save them from the tribe of Judah. Isaiah 9:3, thou hast multiplied the nation and hast not increased the joy. He's multiplied the nation because that's the second part of the Abrahamic covenant promises, that Abraham would have natural descendants that numbered as the sands of the sea and as the stars of the sky, innumerable, dust of the earth even. But it was not the eternal heavenly promises that were made to the natural seed. And again, we learned that in Galatians 3:16, not 14. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith, not unto seeds as of many, not to the natural seed, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So the eternal heavenly promises, the Abrahamic covenant promises, are going to be granted to those who are in the spiritual seed, or through the spiritual seed, which is Christ. So he's multiplied the nation, sure, according to the natural seed promise, but has not increased their joy because they were in darkness. Joy comes from being in the light of life, which is through Christ. So the importance of understanding there are 3 components to the Abrahamic covenant promises all the way back in Genesis 12 cannot be understated, that they were never, ever made to the natural seed. They were always going to come through the spiritual seed, which is Christ. So at that point in time, when Jesus comes in Matthew 4, thou hast multiplied the nation. Yep, absolutely. But has not increased the joy because they are a people in darkness. And it was the light who came amidst the darkness, the light has sprung up. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. So eventually, this light that has sprung up among the darkness of this people is eventually going to judge at the very end of days the one who is coming to save them the first time. Again, this light that has sprung up in the darkness. They rejected him. And then he went away. And during the time that he went away, there's this gospel of the dispensation of grace. They rejected him at the triumphal entry. That was the first coming, where he could have, if they had chosen to, he could have presented the kingdom. That was the triumphal entry, the two donkeys coming in to award the double portion, which was prophesied in Zechariah 9. They rejected it. They rejected him. They rejected the offering of the kingdom. It was delayed to a second coming. At the second coming, that same Redeemer that comes through the line of Judah is not going to come as the suffering servant. He's going to come as the victorious king. He actually did come as the victorious king. That was why they said, Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna in the highest. They were welcoming him. The multitudes were welcoming Jesus as the victorious king. But the prophecies in the Old Testament say, and so all Israel shall be saved. It wasn't so much that some of them didn't know what time period they were in. It was that all of them didn't. And the prophecies say that all Israel shall be saved. So what was not a corporate acceptance became a corporate rejection. Blindness was cast over their eyes, and 4 days later, they all demanded his crucifixion. That same who became the suffering servant, Isaiah 53. He was from victorious king to suffering servant because they did not accept him as the victorious king coming to bring the kingdom. They rejected him, demanded his crucifixion. He became the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, and thus fulfilled the works in all jots and all tittles of the old law, the old covenant. Declared it finished, bowed his head, and gave up the ghost. The death and the shed blood on the cross being the tokens of the new covenant, whereby grace we are saved through faith. The new covenant is we are now invited to partake of through the heavenly promises through faith in Christ, to be part of that Abrahamic covenant promises, become sons of Abraham through the promised seed, which is Christ. But there will come a day where that line of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, the victorious king, will come back and he will judge. And that is the reference being made to Isaiah, or being made in Isaiah 9, that yes, he's going to come for a purpose, to accomplish a purpose, which he did during his first coming. But because of how Israel treated him and how they reacted to it, there will be a second coming of that same person. And he came to save Judah. He came from Judah to save all Israel the first time, taking away the sins of the world. According to the law, he was born under the law to redeem a people from the curse of the law. That was all of them. The difference was that he came from Judah, which is why Judah was not given the bill of divorce. Long story short, the whole of Israel did not accept him. Therefore, he went to the cross. 40 days later, he ascended. After the resurrection, death, burial, resurrection, 40 days later, he ascended. He is going to return. And when he returns, it will be in garments rolled in blood. But this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. Isaiah 63. I have trodden the winepress alone, Isaiah 63:3. And of the people there was none with me, for I will tread them in mine anger and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I shall stain my raiment. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. I looked, and there was none to help, and I wondered there was none to uphold. Therefore mine own arm brought salvation unto me, and in my fury it upheld me. How do we know that that's what that's talking about? Well, because the next verse is in Isaiah 9. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Yes, light that sprung up in the darkness. The government shall be upon his shoulders. Yep, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. When is he going to rule? When is the government going to be upon his shoulders? After he judges and in the millennial kingdom. So this is referencing the two comings of Christ. The first one which they wouldn't have known at this time because they had the opportunity to accept him at the first coming, and the presentation of the kingdom could have resulted. He was attempting to bring it. They rejected it. So at this point, they wouldn't have necessarily known that this is talking about two separate comings. However, the fact remains that there will be, at this point, we know now, two separate comings. The first, he was born. The second, he is coming back to destroy sin and wickedness in finality. Well, no, destroy sin and wickedness and set up a righteous kingdom wherein he will rule with a rod of iron. Sin and wickedness will not be destroyed in finality until the great white throne, which is at the end of the 1,000 years, not the beginning of it. To go into the kingdom, it will be destroyed. But then because people are going in their natural bodies and there will be a repopulation, people will still have to choose for him and many will not, as is evidenced by Revelation 20 with the second incursion of Gog and Magog and those attempting to come against the camp of the saints and the holy city for the purpose of overthrowing Christ again. And God sends fire out of heaven to destroy them. And well, that's that. Then sin and wickedness are destroyed in finality at the great white throne. Eternities are set. And that's the end of it. So there's a bit more to this prophecy. However, the prophesied Savior is coming. He's born. That's the first coming. And then ultimately, we know now the second coming will be when he sets up his rule and reign, when he judges sin and wickedness and then establishes his righteous kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. That is the government that it's talking about. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. Upon the throne of David, yes, the Davidic covenant, Psalm 89. "36, his seed shall endure forever, his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever as the moon and as a faithful witness in heaven." That's just a couple of verses, but the whole chapter talks about this. He will rule from the throne of David. The whole reason why the house of Judah is separate and not on account of her not being wicked, not on account of her not playing the harlot and being idolatrous and unfaithful to her God, but on account of Jesus coming through the house of Judah, being of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, and will sit upon and rule upon the throne of David in the millennial kingdom. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. Upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it, to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. The Lord has sent a word into Jacob, and it hath lighted upon Israel. Again, this is the light hath sprung up in darkness. So yes, Judah would undergo a period of judgment. The house of Israel would come under that judgment even sooner on account of being led into captivity in 722-ish rather than 586, which is when the Babylonian captivity occurred and when the house of Judah stopped having its kings. So they would get another 140 years after the house of Israel, but eventually the house of Judah would be judged. However, salvation will come to Israel through Judah. And that is the light of the world, Jesus Christ. All the people shall know, even Ephraim and the inhabitant of Samaria. Ephraim, that's a reference to the Northern Kingdom. The house of Israel, whose capital is Samaria. So all the people shall know, not just the house of Judah, but the house of Israel too. Even Ephraim and the inhabitant of Samaria that say in the pride and stoutness of heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will build with hewn stones. The sycamores are cut down, but we will change them into cedars. So even those people who say, yep, there was stuff happened, bad stuff, but we're going to rebuild ourselves. Well, no, God's going to rebuild, and he's going to do it by himself, through Jesus, who is God the Son, the incarnated God-man. So it's like these people think that they're going to do it on their own. God said, no, I'm going to do it. Therefore, the Lord shall set up the adversaries of Rezin against him and join his enemies together, the Syrians before, the Philistines behind, and they shall devour Israel with open mouth. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So yeah, he's going to judge because wickedness cannot go unpunished. His hand is stretched out. Why? Because there will always be a remnant according to the election of grace. For the people turneth not unto him that smiteth them, neither do they seek the Lord of hosts. Therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day. The ancient and honorable, he is the head. The prophet that teaches lies, he is the tail. So he's going to cut off the old people and the prophets from Israel because they are leading Israel astray. He's going to deal with the problem. People try to do it on their own. No, God's going to do it. He's going to do it the right way, and he's going to do it in the most efficient and effective way, and he's going to put an end to it. For the leader of this people caused them to err, and they that are led of them are destroyed. We see that in the Old Testament, and we also see that in the New Testament. This is, oh, goodness, what video? Oh, I think this was it when I went through the chapters Isaiah 1 and 2, how I set this up with the covenants, the understanding of what the Daniel 9:27 covenant is going to be. There are 7 covenants mentioned in the Bible. 5 are unconditional. They do not pertain to the scope of Daniel 9:27. There are 2 conditional covenants. Both are pertinent to the scope of Daniel 9:27 because one begins the 70th week and one ends the 70th week. The beginning is the return to the Mosaic law. It is the return to the conditional covenant that cannot save them. Can't save them because they aren't capable of following it perfectly. Hebrews 8 explains this. For if the first had been faultless, there would have been no need for the second, for finding fault with them. He saith, behold, the days will come when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not according to the old one, a covenant they break. They continued not in my laws. The second one, God did it himself, because Israel could not do what they needed to do in order to be saved according to the first covenant, because the first covenant is perfect, but the people are not. The imperfect people are not capable of keeping a perfect covenant. So God, who is perfect, intervened in the affairs of man, and he said, okay, you can't do it, but I can. The whole reason Jesus came. And in fulfilling the works of the law, because he was perfect and sinless, he became the substitutionary lamb to take away the sins of Israel because they could not take away their own sin. Man is sinful and deserves to die. Jesus is sinless and never deserved to die. So in that substitutionary role, he became sin who knew no sin, that we might be righteous through the righteousness of Christ. So the whole intent of Daniel 9:27 is to show them that what they think is right is not right. And I explained this when I went through the setup before I got into Isaiah 1, because Isaiah 1 plainly talks about how God hates the sacrificial system as it relates to animals and vain oblations. That is not what he wants. What does he want? Their belief in Jesus. Jesus, the sacrifice, the one and done sacrifice for sin, can take away sin forever. Did and has taken away sin forever. But their return to the Mosaic law with its commandments and its temple and its sacrificial system and system of offerings fails to understand the finished work of Christ on the cross. Not only does it fail to understand, it outwardly rejects, which is why they will be judged during the 70th week, because they're returning to a system that God hates, that God has no pleasure in. His pleasure was found in the sacrifice of Christ. Isaiah 53. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Why? Because what Jesus did dealt with sin in finality, something that the sacrificial system could never do. I'll actually go to Hebrews before I continue in Hebrews 10. For the law having a shadow of good things to come, which means it wasn't the thing, it was a representation that something else was coming. The law having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of those things, and never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. So they returning to this system at the beginning of the 70th week. The one of 2 conditional covenants is the Mosaic covenant. They're going to reinstitute a system to pay homage to their God in a way that he does not want, a way that he abjectly said he hates in Isaiah 1. Why? Because the second conditional covenant, which is a new covenant, is not on their radar yet, but it will be 7 years later. So the first covenant can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereunto perfect, for then would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers once purged should have had no more conscience of sins. But in the law, there was a remembrance made of sins annually. They came in front of the high priest to remember their sin and to atone for it with the sacrifice and the offerings that would then be laid upon the head of the scapegoat, and the scapegoat would bear the sins of Israel into a land not inhabited, into the wilderness. They'd let it go for an offering, signaling the remission of sins, but they did that every year. They would remember and then atone for them. The new covenant is diametrically opposite to that. Sins are not remembered annually. They were remembered once and paid for once, and now they are, where remission of these is, there is no more offering. But more to the point, he specifically says, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and their minds will I write them. Their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. So when you go to Isaiah, when we get into chapters 28 and 29 specifically, it's going to talk about this. That the leaders specifically, in chapter 28 specifically, the leaders of this people, their ancients, their prophets, their spiritual leaders, they are the ones leading Israel astray and into this judgment. Because after Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39 leads right into the coming of the Antichrist and the acceptance of the Antichrist, on the heels of God making himself overt and noticeable and intervening overtly and judging overtly in front of all of Israel and in front of all of the world, so that the God of Israel is known to Israel and is known to the heathen in the world. It's like there's no more mistaking that God exists and that God is on Israel's side after Gog and Magog. So they're in their rush to honor their God for saving them. First of all, they're like, oh my, he exists. So all of the people who weren't following him are now going to follow him because, yeah, he exists. And more to the point, these people who have been in a state of rejection or unbelief that God even exists are going to have no clue what to do. So who are they going to look to? The spiritual leaders in Israel, the prophets and the spiritual leaders in Israel. Do they have it right? No, they don't. And that's what this is a reference to, is that until the spiritual leaders in Israel come to an understanding of what all the prophecies are pointing to and who Jesus is and that Jesus is the Messiah, they are going to lead every single person astray. The light came to a people in darkness, but those people remained in darkness willfully. There will come a point when they will understand and move as we have, just as 1 Peter 2 says. Where are you, 1 Peter? There we are. 1 Peter 2, 9. This is talking about us, not them, but there will come a point when the same understanding is increased for them and they do the same thing, albeit at the end of the 70th week and not before. Ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who had called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. They are afflicted by blindness right now, but there will come a point when they are moved from darkness into light. But it will not come before their ancients and their prophets lead them astray in, I was going to say magnificent, but that's really not the appropriate word, in major ways. For the leaders of this people cause them to err, and they that are led of them are destroyed. Yep. Therefore the Lord shall have no joy in their young men, neither shall have mercy on their fatherless and widows, for everyone is an hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaketh folly. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. For wickedness burneth as the fire, it shall devour the briars and thorns, he shall kindle in the thickets of the forest, and shall mount up like the lifting of smoke. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened, and the people shall be as the fuel of fire. No man shall spare his brother. He shall snatch on the right hand and be hungry. He shall snatch on the left hand, and they shall not be satisfied. They shall eat every man the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh, Ephraim, and Ephraim, Manasseh, and they together shall be against Judah. For all this, his anger is not stretched away, or excuse me, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is still stretched out. So there's a lot going on in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9, because it's not only telling us about what's going to happen, from a historical point at that point in time, but it's also preluding the salvation that would come to Judah through Judah, talking about Jesus. And not only is it talking about his first coming, it's also prophesying the second coming and the establishment of a righteous kingdom. The kingdom, the house of Israel and the house of Judah were certainly not righteous. Not even a little, not even close. And their wickedness would be judged in this point in history and in the future. We know this because of the 70th week. But at the end of all of that, good will come. Good will come. That's why the gospel is good news, because we know that good will come out of it. The good, because our Lord is going to come back and establish a righteous kingdom. Unfortunately, stubborn, hard-hearted, stiff-necked people take a long time to get it. But eventually they will, at least a remnant, because again, the land and the people of Israel will never be destroyed in totality. There will always be a remnant according to the election of grace. Unfortunately, a remnant is only a remnant because there will be certain judgment. So that is those few chapters. Thank you guys for being here. Hi, Dan. Hi, Jenny. Welcome to both of you. As always, if you guys have questions, comments, or feedback, please let me know. And I will be reviewing the next several chapters in Isaiah. I'm going to try to get through more than a few, but these are interesting because these are also prophetic. Actually, I'm going to save a preview of what's coming, but they're goodies. So have a wonderful Sunday, you guys. And I will be back in the near future to go through more. And I have not forgotten about Genesis. So I'll be back with more about those coming chapters too, where we get into the talk of Rebecca and Isaac. So I'll see you guys later. Have a great day.